Welcome back to Reg 1, a new show special by Rebecca, Elena, and Grace. I'm Elena Weber, and today we're going to dive into the rising sectionalism in the U.S. leading up to the Civil War. The Underground Railroad, led by Harriet Tubman and others, contributed to sectionalism in America by establishing an effective escape route for slaves, further deepening the divide between the North and South. Slavery and sectionalism have been pressing issues since early years of the United States of America, and the Underground Railroad served as a catalyst for the increased divide between the North and South. Let's hear from Grace, one of our top historians here at REG, to give us a rundown of the underlying causes of rising sectionalism in the United States. Grace?
Thanks, Elena. First, let's talk about the effects of slavery. The economy of the South depended mainly on the labor of enslaved people planting and harvesting crops, such as cotton and tobacco. The social structure also depended on this. Young farmers in the South aspired to own land and slaves. The North, however, had experienced an industrial revolution during this time. The North did not have to rely on slave labor in the fields, but factory workers and machines for manufacturing goods. This economic and social disparity between the North and South contributed to the underlying sectionalism between the two. Now back to Elena and the Underground Railroad.
Thanks, Grace. You may be wondering how the Underground Railroad got its name. To keep the system as undercover as possible, the free slaves made code names for the features of the Underground Railroad. The term Underground Railroad refers to the entire system, which consisted of many routes called lines. The free individuals, such as Harriet Tubman, Frederick Douglass, and Jonathan Walker, who helped runaway slaves travel towards freedom, were called conductors, and the fugitive slaves were referred to as cargo. The safe houses used as hiding places along the lines of the Underground Railroad were called stations. A lit lantern hung outside that would identify these stations. Once off their owner's land, the escaped slaves faced numerous threats. More often than not, the escapees would be trekking through rough terrain on foot, exposing themselves to dangerous animals, along with ongoing threat of being beaten, thrown in jail, or even killed by their owners if found. However, the escapees invented resourceful ways to communicate to avoid these dangers and successfully escape. Now to Rebecca for an inside look.
Today, I'm talking about quilts and how they played an important role in helping slaves escape. Conductors would hang quilts on the doors or fences to show that their house was safe and provide directions on where to go next. Quilts were a very subtle way to include directions without outsiders cracking the code. Many quilts would include triangles acting as arrows, and if the pattern of all the triangles matched up, then that was the way the escapees would need to go. Other signs used on the quilts were pictures of the North Star and how to find it. Folklife magazine says that bow ties meant escapees needed to find fancy clothes to wear before they entered a house or passed through a town. A cabin meant that the house was safe to enter, and finally, an animal paw meant to follow animal footprints in the woods to find food and water source. Other symbols included bluebirds, meaning follow the birds in the sky and continue north. Stitches that looked very messy were actually a map instead of messy lines. These are just a few examples of different signs that were used to keep escapees safe on their trip to freedom.
Wow, thanks, Rebecca. So how does this relate to rising sectionalism in the U.S.? Because the South's economy and social structure depended on slaves, slaves escaped from the South to the North, a safe haven for slaves, until 1850. Slave owners became frustrated when their slaves kept disappearing, resulting in the creation of the Fugitive Slave Act. This act declared that if a slave was found, they would have to be brought back to their owner no matter what. This further divided the North and South because many people in the North opposed slavery. However, Millard Fillmore, the 13th president, advocated for federal enforcement of the Fugitive Slave Act. Through all the disagreement and hardship, renowned abolitions emerged. Now back to Rebecca for the recount of the testimony of Reverend William Still.
Thanks, Elena. Reverend William Still was one of the most influential abolitionists during the antebellum period of the United States. Born in New Jersey on October 7, 1821, to Levin and Charity Still, he was the youngest of 18 children. Though Still himself was not born into slavery, he gained a unique understanding of the lives of former slaves, as both his mother and father were born into slavery in the South and later migrated to the North with their freedom. African Americans at this time were unable to attend school, so Still, with incredible discipline, taught himself to read and write. Educated African Americans revolutionized the fight against slavery. They were able to study texts, write speeches to fight for their cause, and write letters to white men in power demanding freedom.
Later in his life in 1844, Still married a woman named Letitia George and moved to Philadelphia, where she gave birth to their 4 children. It is in Philadelphia where William Still began his journey as an influential African-American abolitionist, where he was hired as a clerk for the Pennsylvania Society for Abolition of Slavery. When the Fugitive Slave Act was passed in 1850, he was elected chairman of Philadelphia's Vigilance Committee. As an integral agent in the Underground Railroad operation, Still assisted slaves in their trek for freedom, kept meticulous records of the escapees, which eventually helped him track down his own brother, Peter Still, and set them up with shelter, food, and money for a successful life. Later, Still wrote and published the book The Underground Railroad, becoming the only first-hand account of the Underground Railroad written and self-published by a black man.
We know that was a lot, so here are the main takeaways. The divide between the North and South deepened due to the effective nature of the Underground Railroad through code names, quilts, and unity of abolitionists and enslaved people. However, the process was not easy due to natural dangers such as rough terrain and federal dangers such as the Fugitive Slave Law. This has been Reg 1, and thanks for watching.